This is the Wizard, WZRD Chicago 88.3 FM. We have with us today at Wizard a very special guest, Jim DeRogatis, author of Solace, The Case Against R. Kelly. Welcome to Wizard.
Thank
Jim,
you.
how are you today?
I'm doing okay, thank you.
Well, first of all, could you tell our listeners what it was in your background, in your experience that prepared you to write about R. Kelly and investigate?
Well, whether we're talking an aspiring journalist who's studying at Northeastern here or anybody starting out anywhere, you don't necessarily start by covering the beat you hope to cover. I always wanted to be a music critic. When I was in high school, I spent a day with Lester Bangs. People have seen me on TV and they keep wondering who that tattoo on my right wrist is, and that's Lester Bangs, great rock critic. But I spent the first 5 years of my career as a beat and investigative reporter covering crooked politicians and mobsters in New Jersey for the Jersey Journal. You're a reporter first and foremost. If a fire breaks out at the concert that you're reviewing and someone is injured, your lead is not the concert was mediocre last night. You have to go with the news.
Mm-hmm.
So I was a news reporter, even when I got my first professional job as a critic at a magazine in Minneapolis, and then I became the Sun-Times pop music critic in 1991.
Mm-hmm. Who are some of your critics of Solace, The Case Against R. Kelly, and what do those critics say, and what is your response to them?
Well, I think the world has changed since our first story about R. Kelly's predatory behavior of underage girls ran on December 21, 2000.
Mm-hmm.
That is 19 years ago. The world has changed. The Me Too movement has opened people's eyes. And of course, 6 hours of Surviving R. Kelly in January 2019, 5 hours of Surviving R. Kelly Part 2 over the last couple of days. I don't think people are, I think people believe now that this man has hurt many women for 3 decades. The names of 48 women I know whose lives he's ruined. But there are still fans of Kelly who defend him. It's not that they don't believe, it's that they don't care. And so the hatred the women who have spoken out are facing on social media, in their communities, sometimes in their churches, in their families. It's really extraordinary. It takes tremendous amount of courage for these women to tell their stories. First to me for 19 years of reporting, and now to television, and then to get vilified as liars, gold diggers, is just unconscionable.
Would you say that these 48 women help contribute to the Me Too movement being what it is today? Did they have any part in it, in your opinion?
Oh, absolutely. But I think that the tragedy of the Kelly story today in New York, Harvey Weinstein, the Hollywood producer, his trial begins.
Mm-hmm.
The Weinstein story is told in 2 books, one by Ronan Farrow, one by Jodi Kantor and Megan Twohey, who's an Evanston native, now at the New York Times. They got a lot more attention. And why? Weinstein's victims were beautiful white actresses. Gwyneth Paltrow, Mira Sorvino, Annabella Sciorra. And Kelly's victims, the 48 whose names I know, 47 are black women and 1 is a Latina. And, I am only ever repeating what dozens of women have told me through all my reporting when I say that nobody matters less in our society than young black girls. I think race is an inextricable part of this. Kelly is predominantly a black superstar.
Mm-hmm.
Aside from crossover moments like I Believe I Can Fly and the Space Jam film, and his embrace by the Pitchfork Bonnaroo Coachella set in 2013, he has always primarily spoken to black audience. And in particular in Chicago, where this racism of this city that we love but hate, the divide between South and West Side and North Side here where we're sitting now, it's like 2 different worlds. The fact that Kelly was from Chicago, that he became the biggest selling R&B superstar of two generations, 100 million albums sold, he was a hero, and people did not want to turn on him. But the thing that's always horrified me, I understand many black men in our society are torn down and vilified, and racism's at the heart of it. But Kelly's victims were the sisters, the daughters, the aunties of the black community. And didn't they count just as much as he did?
We always hear about the young black men that are who don't matter and who are in danger in our society. So what you're saying is that black women they're even less on the rung of society,
And
lower
it's not
than.
me saying it, it's what dozens of women have
Mm,
told me.
mm,
And you listen to champions like Tarana Burke, who
mm,
launched the Me Too movement way back in 2006, way before Harvey Weinstein. She says this, and
mm.
the women who founded Mute R. Kelly, or Aniki Odelay and Kenyette Tisha Barnes, and columnists like Mary Mitchell at the Sun Times. When Abden Palish and I started our reporting in November and December 2000, Mary, by the next 2 years, had written 3 dozen columns. You know, the problems in the black community of older men preying on underage women are not restricted to R. Kelly. But at the same time, you have to realize I'm a music critic.
Mhm.
You know me. I've got some of my favorite albums amply illustrated on my arms. And you asked me to bring a record with me today, and I was happy to do it. Um, I'm a music critic. In the history of popular music, which has been treating men, has a history of men treating women badly, from way before Frank Sinatra to way after Ryan Adams, there's nobody in that entire more than half a century of pop music, rock and roll, R&B, soul, where we've seen criminal charges of the sort leveled against Kelly. There are now 42 state and federal indictments, felony charges of sexual abuse, of kidnapping, of RICO, which is the racketeering statute they used to bring down mobsters and drug lords, all saying that he ran for 30 years a criminal enterprise designed to prey on underage girls for his sexual satisfaction, bribing witnesses, threatening witnesses. It's extraordinary. He faces, by my count, 2 centuries in jail if convicted of all charges. Nobody in musical history has had a case like that.
Speaking of Ryan Adams, is there any parallel between how you delineate between artist and music in your work as a music reviewer and how you delineate between artist and quote soulless man unquote in your work as an investigative reporter for this book?
Well, that's $1 million question, and I think Surviving R. Kelly Part 2 ends with some discussion of that. Can we separate the art and the artist? A lot of really despicable people make great art. We can go downtown, we can look at the Picasso sculpture in Daley Plaza. Picasso has a history of treating women badly. My answer, as a critic, as a lover of music, and as someone who is horrified by the reporting I've done for 19 years on Kelly, is if the misdeeds of the artist are present in the art, no, we can't separate the art and the artist. Some of the greatest philosophers, some of the greatest thinkers about the nature of art, Oscar Wilde, said, there is no such thing as a moral or immoral book. It is merely good or bad. Okay. He also said, no painter renders a portrait of a subject without including a portrait of himself in that work. So with Kelly, if you look at the history of the album he wrote for Aaliyah when he was having sexual contact with her when she was 15, he titled that album, he wrote the song, Age Ain't Nothing But a Number. When you look at the long canon of super sexualized songs by his own profession, I am the sexual super freak, he would say. I am the Pied Piper of R&B. He is talking about taking his sexual satisfaction wherever he pleases with no regard for his partner whatsoever. And then there's the gospel songs, of course, where he falls to his knees and prays to the Lord in heaven for forgiveness for unnamed sins. And I've always wanted to ask him, Mr. Kelly, please, what were those sins? And we know now well. I mean, the last piece of new music he released was a 19-minute track called I Admit. and he sings. I admit I like all the ladies, older and younger ladies. Some of them want me to spank them. I'm like, okay. This has never been a secret. It was in full view of the world for 30 years. And the fact that Chicago failed these young black women, the courts failed, the civil attorneys failed, the churches failed. Reverend Jesse Jackson's Operation Push was defending Kelly. Media failed. The other news outlets, other than the Sun-Times, and where was Oprah? Where was Michael Jordan? Where were the Obamas? This was never a secret in the south and west sides of this city. You could go up to any woman on the south and west side, and she would have a story about him cruising the Rock and Roll McDonald's, him cruising the Evergreen Plaza shopping mall, him cruising Kenwood Academy and Whitney Young High School looking for underage girls.
What is Reverend Meek's position on R. Kelly now?
Reverend Meeks refused to talk to me for Soulless, the book. He has refused to talk to anyone about Kelly, but he did numerous TV interviews with Kelly after he was indicted in 2002 for making child porn, up to and including the trial in 2008, in which he was acquitted. When I say Chicago failed, Judge Vincent Gaughn, the same man who heard the trial of Jason Van Dyke for shooting Laquan McDonald 16 times in the back, presided over that trial, and he narrowed it in 2008 to one girl on one videotape. He would not allow the evidence of the 4 civil lawsuits of other women who had sued Kelly, of what the Sun-Times had reported, that this was a pattern of predatory behavior, of the Aaliyah incident. It all became one girl on one tape. We now know, thanks to one of the federal indictments, that that girl, who was 14 when R. Kelly urinated in her mouth and had sexual contact with her for nearly a half hour on videotape, she was paid off. Her mother and father were paid off. 14 witnesses testified at that trial.
And she was paid on the video as well.
She was paid on the video. He hands her a wad of cash. It's horrifying. And, how he walked away from that, the two things are horrifying. Number one, how with
How
all
much
that
was
evidence
the video shown in court? Was the entire video
it was
in
shown
court?
dozens of times in court.
The entire video.
The entire video, and then parts of the video, and video on slow motion, and video repeating.
But he was acquitted.
He was acquitted. It was Father's Day weekend. The jury had been sequestered for 4 or 5 weeks. They wanted to go home. The girl didn't testify, the mother and father.
What was the racial makeup of the jury?
It was half black and half white. There was a Baptist, a devout Baptist.
What about for the black jurors? Were they men or were they women?
There were some men and there were some women. The remark that stands with me, there are two, was of a devout Baptist black man who said he was offended when he'd go to 7-Eleven and see pornography there. He was told after the trial by the reporters who interviewed the jurors that there had been many other women besides this girl. And he said, oh my God, if I'd known that, if I'd heard that in open court, I would have voted differently. There was also a man, an ethnic Polish white man from the north side here of Chicago, who said, I didn't like the way the witnesses dressed, the women dressed. They came in the court with short skirts. I didn't believe them. Well, this is rape culture 101 in the sociology and psychology departments and gender studies departments here at the university. I am sure professors would illuminate how women are just not believed in our society when they make charges, especially against very powerful and wealthy men.
Will you have investigated this case if the victim had been other than African American?
Absolutely. I mean, the way this started is I reviewed R. Kelly's 5th album when it was released in November 2000, tp2.com. And I made the observation, and I'd been following Kelly from the start of his career when he rose from busking on subway platforms to singing with a vocal group, Public Announcement, to becoming a solo superstar with 12 Play. You know why the album was called 12 Play?
You could illuminate the listeners because there might be listeners who
Sure.
don't understand.
The average lover might give a woman 4 Play, but R. Kelly was 3 times better, so he would give you 12 Play.
Mm-hmm.
And then it was also a play on a 12-inch vinyl record.
Mm-hmm.
Kelly, I had covered all of this, and I made the observation in my record review, the fact that this started with a record review, I am a music critic, that the greats in R&B and soul. Marvin Gaye, Al Green, Prince often blurred the line between sex and salvation. Saturday night is the hot and horny times. Sunday morning you pray for forgiveness. This is a common trope in R&B, that sex can be spiritual. With Kelly, he veered between two poles with a sort of jarring dichotomy and had never joined the two. This prompted a fax from an anonymous but clearly very well placed source, whose name I do not know to this day, within the Kelly camp, who said, "Dear Mr. DeRogatis, you reviewed R. Kelly, you compared him to Marvin Gaye. Marvin had his problems, but they're nothing like Robert's. Robert's problem is young girls." And this fax stated that he'd been under investigation by the Sex Crimes Unit of the Chicago Police Department for some time, that there was an ongoing relationship with a then 13-year-old girl, the girl in the videotape, that there had been a lawsuit filed in 1996 by Tiffany Hawkins, who the world has now met in Surviving R. Kelly. All these years, she never spoke, and now she has spoken first to me for the book, and then to the world via television.
Yeah,
There was
so
a level of
I read about her
specificity.
in your afterward.
Yeah, there was a level of specificity in this fax. It did not. It could have been about a white musician. It could have been about a black musician. The fact that it was about the best-selling superstar that Chicago's ever produced. We're talking a man who has sold more records than Curtis Mayfield, than Billy Corgan, than anybody you can name. At first, I was not inclined to believe it. I thought, this is somebody trying to drag down a powerful black superstar. But the fact is that the level of specificity, it kind of haunted me. I took it home. I received that fax the Wednesday before Thanksgiving 2000. I threw it in the slush pile. I thought, it's a player hater. And I came back Monday morning and realized, no, you're not going to mention a specific lawsuit. So for us, and for me personally, 19 years of reporting Soulless, The Case Against R. Kelly, my book starts with Tiffany Hawkins' lawsuit. And the fact that Kelly would visit the choir class at Kenwood Academy, where she was a sophomore, and pick up 15-year-olds. Eventually, Kelly not only had sexual contact with 15-year-old Tiffany Hawkins, but 5 of her 15-year-old friends and her best friend, Aaliyah.
Have you advocated on behalf of African Americans' struggles before your work on the R. Kelly case?
That's an interesting question. I'm a music critic. If I am reviewing Kendrick Lamar's To Pimp a Butterfly, I am, by virtue of listening to, caring about, taking seriously that music, writing about the Black Lives Matter movement. If I'm interviewing Mavis Staples, here is a woman who marched arm in arm with her sisters and Dr. King on the streets of the South, and the fire hoses were turned on her, the dogs were let loose, the batons were swinging, and she sang. Am I saying that the Staples singers changed the world with their music? No. But they changed us. They made us realize how important that struggle for civil rights are. So you have to see, as a music critic, you want to talk about Nirvana? It was not a surprise to me, the sad ending of Kurt Cobain. Generation X had problems with depression and drugs. If you were listening to the man and his music and taking it seriously, you heard about this. If you listened to the first album by NWA, whose title I can't say on the radio, what happened in the wake of the Rodney King verdict, the riots in Los Angeles, would not have been a surprise. Music is never just music. So, advocating, was I marching in the street? No, my role was to listen to music and musicians and tell their stories.
How do you think your R. Kelly investigation has helped improve the place of young African American girls and women in American society?
Well, when they've told me no one matters less than young black girls, I would hope that's
Who told you that again?
dozens and dozens of young black women. And activists in the community, and psychologists, and teachers, and therapists.
Were there any men who told you that?
Well, it's interesting. There have been several black academics who are vilifying, for example, the Mute R. Kelly movement. They're calling it cancel culture. They are saying it's censorship. And see, knowing Orenike and Kenyette, who launched that activist movement, I don't see it that way. I see it as consumer, a consumer choice. What am I talking about? I like me some chicken sandwiches. You can tell. I will not eat at Chick-fil-A because of their attitudes toward homosexuals and their support of right-wing causes. That's a consumer choice.
Mhm.
I won't shop at Walmart. I'll go to Target. Won't shop at Walmart because they'll sell bullets but not birth control. So that's just me as a consumer. What Mute R. Kelly was saying is do not burn his records. I mean, that's Nazism. That's censorship.
Mhm.
They're saying don't give your money to a man who is going to use it, who has used it for 30 years to prey on your daughters, your sisters, your aunties. I think that makes a lot of sense. Um, so I don't, with certain exceptions, John Legend stepped forward in the Surviving R. Kelly documentaries to talk about Kelly, but where is Jay-Z? Jay-Z made 2 albums with R. Kelly. Where is Chance the Rapper? The girl on the videotape, her brother plays with Chance the Rapper's band. What I'm saying is there's a superstructure. Common, one of the most woke voices in hip hop, only came out very late and said, I never realized I should have become more aware of what R. Kelly was doing and said something. I think men stood by. And there was that facile, I've gotten from many men. Well, Elvis Presley married Priscilla. She was 15. Jerry Lee Lewis married his 14-year-old second cousin. Jimmy Page, Led Zeppelin, had a 15-year-old girlfriend, Laurie Matt. Yeah. 48 women whose names I know. 48 lives ruined. That sounds hyperbolic. But Tiffany Hawkins attempted suicide. I know of 3 other attempted suicides by young women after their sexual contact underage with R. Kelly ended. Others suffer from a sort of PTSD, manic depression. Nobody has done this to get famous, to get 15 minutes on Lifetime. Yeah, and really, television. It's more like 2.5 minutes, right? Lanita Carter, the hair braider who talked in part 2, who is really being championed on social media. You could see the pain. Dominique Gardner, who first spoke to me for the New Yorker, you can see the pain in these women. They're not acting. 48 women can't be lying.
How can solace the case against R. Kelly prejudice potential juries in the R. Kelly case?
Well, you have this question whenever there are super famous men about to go on trial. This morning, there's a long piece in the New York Times by Jodi Kantor and Megan Twohey, the Pulitzer Prize winning reporters who broke the Harvey Weinstein story, that it's going to be hard in New York to find people who are not aware of who Harvey Weinstein is. It's going to be hard in Chicago to find people who are not aware of who R. Kelly is. But fascinatingly, in the 2008 trial, there were many people who were only vaguely aware. There was one woman on the jury who lived in Olympia Fields, not far from his mansion, barely knew anything about him. There were other people who knew, he did that I Believe I Can Fly song. That's about it. There's a lot of people in this country, witness the number of people who are still even unaware of what the impeachment charges against President Trump are, who just are not tuned into the news. We can argue, does that make for a good jury if they care so little about their community to know the news in their community? I don't know. But that's not my job. My job was to tell the stories of all of these women. I never chased them. They came to me. Mr. DeRogatis, I've read the work you've done. I admire it. I've been hurt. No one will listen to me. Can I talk to you?
Do you have any indication about whether or not your investigation helped the charges to actually be filed? If it weren't for your investigation and the press coverage, would the charges have been filed?
No, no, absolutely not. The producers of Surviving R. Kelly have told me that they would not have been able to make the documentary the first time without my reporting. Uh, it took me 9 months and approaching, and in some cases working for months with 5 different news organizations to publish the cult story about Joy Savage and Azrael Clary that first ran in July of 2017. This is not a story that journalists were eager to tackle. This is not a story that was easily done. This is a story that required thousands of hours of reporting.
Well, there are a lot of very dedicated investigative reporters. Why weren't the other reporters eager to take out this case? If you had the information, they didn't. But
Yeah, but that's a question I've been asking throughout this entire ordeal of 19 years of reporting. I continually said, where is the rest of the media? These stories, as I said earlier, you talk to 3 or 4 women on the south or west sides, 3 out of 4, if not 4 out of 4, are going to have these stories. Where was the rest of the media? Where was Rolling Stone? Where was Billboard? Where was Vibe? Where were the Washington Post and the New York Times? They were not in Chicago. They did not care. I believe that if they were white victims of Kelly, it would have been a different story. I think it always comes back to race. I was never territorial about this story. I would have welcomed other reporters breaking elements of this story. And that never happened until very recently. I mean, there are now some excellent young reporters in Chicago, Megan Krepow, Morgan Green, Sam Charles at the Sun-Times, the other 2 are at the New York Times, Bob Chiarito, who strings for the New York Times. There are great reporters now, and I'm glad. And they're all 15 or 20 years younger than me.
Yeah, Sam was your student?
Sam Charles was my student at Columbia College. Yeah, I'm an associate professor in the English department.
Oh, he was. So he was your student in English, not in reporting.
Well, what I teach blurs the lines, just like what I do in my career. I teach reviewing the arts and cultural criticism in the arts and journalism as literature, the great tradition of Tom Wolfe and Joan Didion. So yeah, there's a little bit of I don't color neatly in anybody's lines, and I don't believe in genre, and I really never saw color. You asked that question about race. When I'm hearing the stories of people like Tiffany Hawkins, Patrice Sampson, Montina Woods, I was not seeing 15-year-old black girls. I was seeing my 15-year-old daughter. I just didn't, and people who say, white men especially, who say, I don't see color. I mean, 99.9% of that is bull. But I just didn't see why Tiffany Hawkins mattered any less, Dominique Gardner mattered any less than some beautiful white actress. I never saw that.
Mm. And you really didn't see why other reporters didn't step up to the plate that you did.
Yeah, I don't understand. My initial first 4 or 5 years of reporting was done with Abden Palish. Abden calls himself an Irish-Polish leprechaun. He's about 5 feet nothing, and he's very leprechaun looking. And Abden and I were ringing doorbells throughout the south and west side of this city.
He was the legal reporter.
He was the court reporter, and I'm the music reporter. I talked to people. He talked to lawyers, is how I put it, and cops, although we both developed sources throughout Chicago. We were not part of the community, but as soon as it became obvious that we were not cops or trying to sell somebody something, the number of houses we were invited into offered tea, people crying on our shoulders, people saying, thank you for listening, no one has wanted to listen. It was overwhelming. And any other reporter coming from anywhere would have found the same thing. So where were they? That's the question that haunts me.
Has R. Kelly's attorneys filed any libel lawsuits against you?
In 19 years of reporting, hundreds of stories for the Chicago Sun-Times, for BuzzFeed, for WBZ, for the New Yorker, and 130,000 words in Soulless. I have never been sued for libel. I have never been subject to a correction or even a clarification. 19 years of reporting stands unchallenged. And why? Because I got it right. It's the truth. If anything, there are big elements of the story that I could never verify that are not yet out there. Some of them are coming out now. The allegations in Surviving R. Kelly 2 that he also had sex with young men. I never talked to a man who had sex with him. I never reported that. You hear a lot of stories, and it becomes difficult to separate gossip, rumor. What I reported for 19 years are things that I could nail and verify 20 times over, every single fact.
That takes a lot of work and dedication.
Yeah, I'd prefer to be here today talking with you about how great the Lizzo record is, or Taco Cat, 2 of my favorite records last year. How about that Sturgill Simpson album, all right? I love music, and I believe in its power to make our lives better, the world better. This presented to me as someone who's obsessed with music, considers it a life force, my reason for living, this presents to me a very sad problem. If music can change the world by changing us, right, for the better, can it also be the ultimate tool to lure people to someplace dark and horrible and ultimately destructive? That really, really haunts me.
Did you think of this before the R. Kelly case?
I have. I mean, when I was coming up in New York in the mid '80s, there was a big hardcore punk scene, and the hardcore punk scene had been infiltrated at points by skinheads, right? But something about the nature of the best punk rock, name for me a really great anti-Semitic white power band. There isn't. There isn't. I mean, the fact is that something about the power of music is not conducive to spreading hatred. There just has never been. And now, certainly, we've had plenty of misogyny. This is why the Me Too conversation now, the Rolling Stones, Mick Jagger at 75, recently toured, $500 a seat for the bleachers, the nosebleed seats at Soldier Field, and they're still playing Brown Sugar. Listen to the lyrics of Brown Sugar. It's a sexual fantasy about a slaveholder who enjoys whipping the black women right around midnight. What the hell are you doing, Mick Jagger? Why is it? And I feel the same way about Eminem's many fantasies of killing his ex-wife, Kim. There has been a long, troubling history of misogyny in rock and roll, in soul, in R&B, in blues. Um, this is now, the complications are myriad for the music critic and professor. I don't believe that the countless blues artists who sang about shooting their baby down by the river actually did that. You can sing about troubling things and use it as catharsis. Let me purge myself of these evil feelings by singing about them. And then where it gets singularly different is that R. Kelly sang about these things and did them. And it's quite possible that Michael Jackson, when you listen to the last two albums of his career, he's directly addressing the charges against him that he had sex with underage boys, sexual contact with underage boys. But we can count those examples on one hand. Alfred Hitchcock didn't murder Janet Leigh in the shower in Psycho. He portrayed something difficult. That's what art does.